Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast that helps you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and this week I'm taking a look at the always interesting and ever-evolving ruck line. This week's rankings episode will run slightly different to the defenders and midfielders episode already out. If you missed those, you can go back and check them out, as well as the first episode this pre-season, which went into detail on the best rookie prospects with draft expert Dylan Alexander. So go back and check them out if you haven't already. So for the rucks, I've only got a list of 10 players ranked who I believe will likely be available in your leagues, which is obviously much less than the previous episodes with the defenders and mids, where it was a list of 30. So in addition to ranking the individual ruckmen, I thought I'd have a look through all 18 of the AFL clubs and rank them based on the likelihood of them moving to a two-ruck setup after the AFL changed the number of players on the bench from 4 to 5 and removed the sub-role. So before I get started on the ranks, let's revisit that rule change and the many others the AFL have introduced for season 2026 and look at the chances of them impacting the scoring output of rucks in the fantasy world, which has been widely speculated this pre-season. So the rule changes coming into effect that might affect our ruck scoring. Rucks will now be unable to cross the centre line before engaging with their opponents at a centre ball up, and that's probably going to hurt the more wrestling type rucks, the bigger bodies, and probably advantage the more agile guys. As for the ball up, you'll notice I said ball up, not a bounce anymore. There will be no more bounces at the centre bounce. It's going to be a ball up every time. Umpires now also have the authority to restart play around the ground without a nominated ruck present. And this is, the overall idea behind all these rules is just an attempt to speed up the game and try and limit congestion. But what's interesting about this change is you might have a couple of the bigger ruckmen, the more lumbering types, caught down in a forward pocket and the play is already up at the wing and then there's a ball up. The umpire is no longer going to wait for those big rucks to catch up with the rest of the ground. So there's going to be a lot more quick ball ups where the ball up will just be contended by whichever players are standing there for each side. So I think there's going to be a slight decrease for those bigger rucks in terms of contests that they can get to. And then that leads itself into the next rule, which is, the 5-man bench with no subs. And those two rules combined probably makes sense that clubs are going to look at playing two rucks instead of just the one with a chop out. And that's going to have a big effect, probably the biggest effect if that happens. The other rules, the last disposal to replace the insufficient intent rule, which I think probably won't impact as much as maybe think it will. It's just going to make things simpler and more black and white for the umpires and the players and the fans. And then the last one's the stand rule, where players within 5 metres of a mark or free kick, when it's paid, must stand, cannot move out of the protected area. And I think that rule will impact a little as well. I mean, if you imagine, say a big Max Gawn who's involved in a contest and there's a mark taken by the opposition at, the middle of the ground, he's not going to man the mark. He's going to get up and boot scoot out of there and try and fill a hole in the back line. And that's someone like Gawn, a great opportunity for those plus sixes with those big marks he takes. But now they're going to be a bit stricter that if you're in the 5 metres, you have to man the mark. So we're going to see some ruckmen get stuck standing on the mark, which, will impact their ability to get the ball, obviously, down the field. So lots of rule changes for season 2026, and it'll be hindsight that really tells us who and what or if and how it affects the fantasy world. But certainly it does mean we have to just look at our ruckman a little bit differently and prepare for maybe a bit of a change this year. So that's why in this episode, not only going to do the rankings of the rucks you should be targeting, but also do a bit of a deep dive on each club itself and their current ruck setup, and whether or not I think they're going to be pushing into a two-ruck setup, which will obviously negatively impact those ruckmen. So on to the rankings, and before I do start with them, I just want to address a really good question I received during the week from Daniel Bird at Vulcan Left Hand on X, and he asked what metrics I use to select these lists, as plenty of the names I've ranked are already owned in his league. So like last year, I am just using last year's average as a base metric and picking a likely cutoff. So for the ruckman, I'm setting the mark at anyone who averaged less than 90 last year, because in my mind, the likelihood of a ruck who averaged over 90 being cut is pretty small. And there's exceptions. I know guys like Riley O'Brien, Toby Nankervis, who won't be in these rankings. It would make sense to cut them and then just try and redraft them. But I have to draw the line at a point, and with the defenders and the mids and the forwards, I do it at a different average. So next week, the average for the forwards will be much smaller. Now, I am able to get the ownership numbers of the current ownership numbers on the Keeper Fantasy platform. Thanks greatly to Ryan Power, who's always happy to help out with resources for this podcast. But the data is just a bit skewed because there's such a difference in when leagues finalise their delistings. So there'll be some leagues right now who delisted late last year and have already done their draft. And then there'll be others who haven't even done the delistings yet, and they'll do their draft late Feb. So it's just, the ownership wouldn't give me what I'm after. I'm just going off the average and using a bit of common sense to put together a pool of players that I can then rank from. It's not a perfect science, and I appreciate the feedback. Always looking at ways to improve this process. So as always, I base my rankings on a 30-player squad, which keeps 15 players every year and has the common on-field formation of 5 defenders, 7 midfielders, 1 ruck and 5 forwards. And this is particularly important to note for the ruck line, as many leagues will use a utility spot, offering the option of fielding 2 rucks instead of 1, which obviously makes things very different in how we rank our ruckmen. All right, that's probably the longest preamble I've done on a rankings episode. I think it's well and truly time to get stuck into it. Let's have a look at my top 10 rucks likely to be available in your leagues who averaged less than 90 in season 2025. And there is one guy who averaged under 90 who I haven't ranked because I know for sure he'll be owned, and I'll tell you who that is after I've done my 10. Number 1, and we've been here before with Sean Darcy from Freo. Always injured is probably how I'd best describe Darcy's last few years, which has coincided with the emergence of Luke Jackson. But the reality is with Darcy, he is a proven scorer, and he's done it. He did it early in his career. Started with an average over 80 in his first year. He's gone at 94. He's gone at 95 just a few years ago. So really there's a couple of things that have put him most likely in your pools is, how good Luke Jackson is, and also the fact that you just can't trust his body. But this preseason, and we've heard it before, but he's looking as trim as he's ever looked. He's looked as fit as he's ever looked. And that's why I have him at number 1, as well as the fact that all the reports this preseason are that he's been rucking in all of their internal games and practices. And, this Luke Jackson as a pure bid experiment looks to continue. Now, unfortunately, just before recording this, the news of a calf injury for poor Darcy has emerged. And it sounds like it's on the lower end of the scale, but it's just the sort of thing, you don't want to hear if you're chips in on a guy like this. But I just think with Darcy, he's got the scoring potential. He's only 27 still, and I think there's still a chance that he ends up going to another club. And that's why this pickup is maybe not necessarily about what he can do for you this year, but if he gets to another club in the future, because they're going to try again to make this Jackson and Darcy partnership work. But if it's not working and they really just want to embrace Jackson as the man, there won't be a shortage of suitors for a Sean Darcy, and I could see him ending up at, say, a Geelong as their number one, and then could end up being a real top line scoring ruck for us. Number 2 is a guy that, the more I think about it with that Sean Darcy injury, I probably should have had this guy at number 1, but I'm really big on this guy. Kieran Briggs at the Giants had a really poor 2025, just averaging 70, and would have been a huge disappointment for coaches who quite rightly would have been expecting, a really big year. I really like him. At 26, he's already got 2 seasons averaging over 90 under his belt, and I think that's really good because ruckmen take a lot longer to develop and go into their prime and certainly break out in a fantasy world. So seasons 23-24, he averages in the 90s. What happened last year to bring him all the way down to 70? He did suffer a pretty unpleasant injury in opening round, I think it was. Opening round or round 1. It started the season, and it was a pretty heavy concussion, but also a neck injury that I remember at the time looked really bad and fortunately wasn't a serious injury. But I do wonder if that stayed with him a little bit throughout the season. His time on ground numbers were much lower than what they really are. And he didn't look himself and he just had an off year. So I'm pretty confident that it was an off year, an outlier. And I reckon he bounces back. And at that age, as, pretty much very little competition at this stage as the number 1 at the Giants, he's someone I'd be very keen on grabbing. Number 3 is Jordan Sweet at Port Adelaide. This will be his 3rd season for the Power after coming across in 2024. After a few years stuck behind Tim English at the Doggies. And I think he's done a pretty good job. I mean, certainly in terms of scoring, he's been pretty consistent and solid with averages over 80 both years. He's 27. He's a really good age. It's the perfect age for a big ruck breakout. And I just think he's pretty safe. Well, look, I thought that he was pretty safe. I've just heard again in recent days that Dante Vicentini has been really pushing hard for the number 1 spot, and there's a possibility he could take it. I would not have expected that a few months ago, but it's pre-season. We hear lots of things. I guess we'll see as things roll on. But I still like Sweet. I'd back him in to keep the spot and have a bit of a breakout and get closer to that 90 average that, the really good ruck sort of hit. Number 4 is Nick Bryan at Essendon, coming off an average of 58. He's 24. He's a very good age for a ruckman if you're looking for someone for the long term. And the good thing with Bryan at the Bombers is it's all kind of gone its way. Todd Goldstein has retired finally. And Sammy Draper's headed over to Brisbane. So there's not a lot of competition. Now, the only issue for Nick Bryan is he is coming back from an ACL injury, which he sustained in gather round last year. So he won't be ready for the start of the season, which gives some of those other rucks a chance to sort of keep him out. But I'm very firm in my belief that long-term Nick Bryan is the number 1 ruck for the Bombers. And he's probably not going to give you a great deal this season on field. He's more of a stash guy. But I think once he gets in, he'll make it his own, and he's going to be a solid player for many years to come, albeit coming off an ACL. And, fingers crossed, he comes back fit and ready to go. Number 5 is Matt Flynn from West Coast, and he's an interesting guy. He's kind of disappointed me in terms of my expectations of him since he came across to the Eagles. Third season at West Coast after 3 years at GWS. And I think, at the start of 2024 when he came across, I was all in on him. I thought he's going to take the number one spot. He's going to be a really solid scorer. And he struggled. He had injuries. He barely played in that first year. Last year, he did make it his spot, and he averaged 79, which really isn't too shabby, to be fair. So I think at the age of 28, I wouldn't be surprised to see a career year coming out from him this year. And, they've got Bailey Williams, West Coast, who I don't think, at times was preferred to Flynn, which I just find staggering. So anyway, I think Flynn's going to make it. I think he's going to be much better, and he can get an average up to 85 to 90 even this year. So he's certainly someone you could have as your ruck, but I guess just with that uncertainty, you would want to have cover and a backup. Number 6, and the first of a few very young guys on my list here, and it's Ned Moyle for Gold Coast. I was very bullish on him 12 months ago, and I kind of thought we'd see more of a handover between Jared Witts and him. He only got an opportunity in 3 games, Moyle, and Witts. Look, the thing with Witts is, even though he'd be 32, 33 now, he's just still so good, and the Suns are in the hunt for a flag. So I don't necessarily think Moyle will get that shot this year, but I'm still very big on him. And if you're in a deep league that you can stash a ruck year on year, I'm very adamant that Moyle, when he gets the reins and the number one spot at the Suns, will be a very impressive scorer. He's only 23, still very young, and it would just take a Witts injury. Obviously, not hoping for that, but it would take that, and I think Moyle comes in and starts straight away at an 80 average. So I'm very bullish on him. He's just got to wait for old Witsy to hang up the boots. Number 7 is Dante Vicentini from Port Adelaide, another young guy at age 22. Last year was his 3rd year on the list, and he played 8 games. We got a bit of a look at him, and he looked pretty good. I reckon he stood out a couple of times when I watched, but I didn't really see him getting much of an opportunity to overtake Jordan Sweet this year. But as I mentioned when I spoke about Sweet, is that there's talk this pre-season that it might actually be happening. He might even have his spot ahead of round 1. So look, if you can grab a guy who's that young, stash him on your bench as a backup to your main guy, and he does end up getting that number 1 spot from such a young age, you could be sitting on someone who in a few years could break out and be a really big scorer, which, depending on the age of your current ruck, it could be a perfect time for a handover. So I wasn't that big on him until I heard that news, I'll be honest. I like the look of him, and I like him for the future, but if he's going to jump in this year and put Sweet to the side, there's obviously a fair bit to like about him. Number 8 is the mythical Toby Conway at Geelong. And I call him that because I've read so much and heard so much about this guy, and I just feel like I have barely seen him, and I wouldn't even know what he looks like, to be fair. But all the talk has been for a long time that he's going to be the Cats' main man in the ruck, and he's going to be a great scorer. This will be his 4th year. He played a game in 2023, played 5 games in 2024, averaged 75, which is pretty strong. Didn't get on the ground last year because of those continuous injuries, and now he's at a point where, I don't know, I still have confidence because he is only 22, and obviously the concern is if he gets in, he's going to take a long time to develop anyway, being a ruck and being a young ruck. But the reason I still think it's going to happen for him, if his body holds up, is Geelong, for just the longest of times, have not really had a great ruck. I mean, no shade on Reece Stanley, and Mark Blitzarves has been in there, and and then the Cats have shown you don't need a dominant ruck to be a really strong side. They won the flag a few years ago, but it's always been an obvious sort of gap that they don't have a main ruck. And in the trade period just gone, I thought for sure they'd grab someone, and it just didn't appear that they went all that hard. I know that they did try and get Rowan Marshall, and St Kilda just said, nah, he's staying. But I wonder if Geelong maybe could have been a bit more desperate to get Marshall and thrown a bigger offer, just paid overs to get him across from St Kilda. So the fact that they didn't, and I haven't heard much about them sniffing out any other rucks, I feel like they still think Conway will be the man. And I guess in a keeper league, if you've got the ability to stash a guy, he's a great one to do it. And just fingers crossed we get a good look at him this year and he can play, and we can make a decision on what we think of him then. But right now it's hard. It's hard to ignore because the talk's been there, but it's also hard to get too excited because those injuries have just held him down. Number 9 is his Geelong teammate, Mark Blitzarves. One of the most versatile players I think we've ever seen in the AFL. And even though he's 34 now and trying to predict where he's going to play from week to week and where his scores are going to be week to week is really hard, I just know that in the right role, he can score. He's put up some really good scores in the past, and he even averaged 90 in 2022 when they won the flag. All fanciful stuff. I'm sure he's going to be probably not someone you want on your field, but I don't know. He scored over 90 on 6 games last year, so I think you could do worse if you are super desperate late in the draft just for a ruck that's just going to play. And he's certainly not going to be someone you grab early. And if possible, you just run him off the bench and maybe loop him if you can and get a decent score here and there. And lucky last at number 10 is the youngest player in this list, and that's Nick Madden from the Giants. He is 21 years old, got a debut last year, scored 80 on debut, which was pretty cool to see. And look, if you've got Kieran Briggs already, then grabbing this guy's a no-brainer. It's your classic handcuff move. If Briggs goes down or somehow Madden overtakes him, you're all set. I really like this guy. He looked good in the few games he had last year. He got a chance. And I've heard some good things this pre-season about him. He's super young, so he's someone you're grabbing and stashing away. I would have said into the future, well and truly a few years away. But who knows? If Briggs doesn't come on this year and make it his own, maybe we see a young Madden come in, or maybe the two of them play together. But as someone to grab for the future, and you're in a hurry to get the next big thing, say you've got a Cherry or even Tim English, Nick Madden could be one of those guys in 3 or 4 years. And that's my 10. I'll just do a couple of quick special mentions because there's a guy that I just left out of the 10 after I looked at his numbers. So Mark Pittonet at Carlton, he's 29. He averaged 70 last year. I think that's just about his best average. And so I was thinking, Carlton brought Liam Reedy across from Freo to help out. But after Tom De Koning left, I was surprised they didn't try and find a bigger fish. So they have a lot of faith in Pittonet, clearly, as the number one man. And I wondered, what is his scoring when Tom De Koning's been out of the side? And I had a quick look. In the last 5 years, there have been 24 games that Pittonet played pretty much sole ruck as De Koning wasn't playing. And in that time, in those 24 games, he averaged 70. So he's just a 70 guy, even when he's got the job to himself. And I do think he'll be sharing with Reedy. So that's why I left Pittonet out of my rankings. And the other guy, there's a couple more. Lachlan McAndrew at Adelaide. He's 25. He's obviously behind Riley O'Brien. I think there's a bit of a feeling, though, at the Crows that, maybe a different ruck could help them. And I know there's a lot of the fan base that probably think that. I'm not quite inclined that way, but yeah, McAndrew is going to get a chance at some point. So just keep an eye on when that happens. And then the other guy, Vigo Vicentini at Essendon, much like his brother at Port, is a young, a ruck that's had a bit of a go and looked okay. And look, he'd be every chance, I guess, with it just being Nick Bryan as the other guy. So another guy to keep an eye on, but just not enough to make my top 10. And so the guy that didn't make the list because even though he averaged under 90, I just don't think that he'd be available in any of your leagues. And it's Tom De Koning, now of St Kilda. He's 26. He averaged 85 last year, and I have huge raps on this guy. He's moved to the Saints, who didn't move Marshall on, but I still think he goes to the next level. I think what we saw in that opening month last season was enough for me to tell me he's going to be a star. Will just be, very interesting to see how they use the two of them, him and Rowan Marshall. So let's have a look at it. I've gone through all 18 clubs and I've ranked them based on the likelihood that they run with a two-ruck setup in 2026, which is something that we're all kind of suspecting is going to happen to a lot of clubs with the addition of one extra man on the bench and, of course, the removal of the sub. So with these rankings, if you have a player who's the starting ruck for this side, I guess you probably want to hear that team towards the end, because the side ranked number first is the most likely to run with two rucks. And I'll start it now with Fremantle. It's no surprise. I mean, they've run with two rucks as much as when everyone was healthy for the last few years anyway. So I only see that continuing. Although, as I mentioned earlier, talking about Sean Darcy, the fact that they have been using Luke Jackson as an on-baller, it looks like that's going to continue this season. But then they also added Mason Cox. And I would be surprised to see all three of those big boys lining up. But the fact that Jackson, kind of could be a mid/forward/ruck kind of makes Cox a possibility as well. But I'm sure he's just insurance. Ranked number 2 is St Kilda. Tom De Koning, a big signing for them in the trade free agency period. But then the big surprise was that they didn't let Rowan Marshall get to Geelong. So now we've got De Koning and Marshall, and their backups are young Isaac Keeler, who showed a little bit last year. He got a few games. And then Mitch Owens, who's not a ruckman, but he does work as a backup. I think with the addition of De Koning to Marshall already there, the days of Mitch Owens attending ruck contests is, probably over. So how do I see it sort of looking for the Saints? I think De Koning's the man. I think he's going to be the number one ruck. I think we've seen in the past, years gone by, that St Kilda don't mind Marshall's forward craft. We've seen him play forward in the past. Even when he was emerging and we kind of thought he was going to be the main man, they stuck with Paddy Ryder and they used the two of them. Many years ago now, of course. But I just think you don't bring Tom De Koning across on that sort of money and not make him the number one ruck. And it's a formidable duo. I think the knock-on effect is De Koning has a big year, and I reckon he goes over 90. Rowan Marshall could do similar, but I think he could pick up forward status, which would make him... Well, look, you take a bit of a dip on his average, but then you add the position of forward status. It sort of balances out, I think, for Marshall owners. Number 3, I've got Brisbane. They brought Sam Draper across from the Bombers because Oscar McInerney is retired. Now, they did use Darcy Fort a lot in the last couple of years. He's a 2-time premiership player for them now. And they've got Henry Smith, young fella in the background there who did play last year, I believe, a couple of games and looked okay. But look, I'm pretty big on Draper. I thought he was going to be the next big thing at Essendon, and it didn't happen. And now he's over at Brisbane, and I guess the concern is he's coming off this, Achilles rupture, which is a nasty injury. And yeah, so look, I think to start the season, you'll see the both of them, Draper and Fort, together. But I think long-term, Fort is moved out pretty quick and Draper becomes the man. And he's at a good age. I think he's 27, and I reckon it's time. Now, the reason he wasn't involved in my rankings earlier is because he does have forward status as well as ruck this season. So I haven't looked ahead, but I dare say he might get a mention in the forwards episode. Number 4 is Hawthorn, and this pains me to put Hawthorn here because I'm a Lloyd Meek owner in both my keeper leagues. So the word that I've heard this pre-season about Ned Reeves maybe pushing Meek for that spot or even playing the two of them together, I don't like it at all. They've got some backup in Max Ramsden, who's I think more of a forward, but he did play a bit in the ruck last year, and Mabior Chol is one of their main sort of chop-out guys, but he's a forward. So I don't know. I'm worried that they'll play Reeves with Meek and have a look at it, and I guess the hope as a Meek owner is that it doesn't work and they just stick with him, or that they do it for long enough and Meek plays forward and picks up forward status. That's probably a bit fanciful, but I'm a bit worried about that. So we'll see what the Hawks do. Number 5 is Port Adelaide, and I've got Jordan Sweet as the main man, and I had Ivan Soldo as the backup, but, recent weeks, Dante Vicentini's really showed something, and there's word, as I mentioned earlier in the episode, that he's a chance to take Sweet's spot. So I guess the likelihood of them playing two rucks does seem pretty high to me, because Soldo, I know he's nowhere near it at the minute, but he would be a perfect guy to play with one of Sweet or Vicentini just because of what he offers in the forward line. Could I see Sweet and Vicentini playing together? I mean, I guess so. I don't know how well Sweet is, ahead of the ball in terms of his forward 50 stuff, but I guess it's probably just the unknown that has them at this spot in my rankings. And yeah, I'd be a bit nervous if I had shares in Geordie Sweet. Number 6, I've got Gold Coast, who could very well start that Wits to Ned Moyle transition now by using the two rucks setup and playing them together, rather than resting Wits and giving Moyle a game or two here or there. They may end up just playing the two of them for large chunks this year, which is great. We get to see more of Moyle. But yeah, I guess it's just going to affect Wits and his ability to will just be that consistent sort of 90s guy that he has been for so long. They've got Ethan Reid, who's at the moment more of a forward, but he can play as a ruck as well, and they're obviously going to continue to develop him. Number 7, Carlton, and I've got Mark Pitnet as the man, but I'd be very surprised if we didn't see Liam Reedy playing with Pitnet, at least to start the year and probably for most of the year. Reedy came from Freo, and he, tough gig getting a ruck spot at Freo with Darcy and Jackson there, and now Mason Cox. But yeah, Reedy, I've heard he's not. I've heard that he doesn't have a great forward game, but in saying that, he's only played 3 AFL games, I'm pretty sure, in the time he's been around. So yeah, look forward to seeing him, Blues fans. I reckon he'll be given a real opportunity. And they've got a young guy, Hudson O'Keefe, who did play last season as well, but I think is probably a few years away from any sort of consistent football. Number 8, I've got West Coast. And they're a candidate for the two-ruck setup just because Matt Flynn is number one, but Bailey Williams is a forward who can also play ruck. So I guess it's it's really likely that they play the two of them. I guess the question is, how much do they play the two of them as a two-ruck setup versus Flynn's our ruck, Williams plays forward, and will just chop out every now and then. So if the two are named together, I'd be fascinated to see what the ruck split is, and I'm not sure where else on the ground Flynn can go that he'd be as effective. So that's an interesting watch. They've got Harry Barnett, a young guy coming through as well. Big raps on him. Would love to see a bit more of him in the next few years. And then they've just grabbed Cooper Duff-Tytler in the 2025 draft. In the early picks, I think he was, I can't remember now, number 3 or 4, very early. And, you don't often see a ruck taken that early in the draft. There's been comparisons made to Luke Jackson. I think I'd be surprised if we saw, I think we might see him this year, but I'd be surprised if he, jumped ahead of everyone too soon. It'll take a few years for that to happen. Number 9 is a surprise in that it's Melbourne, and I didn't think Gawn would ever have the possibility of sharing with someone, but the reality is for Melbourne, they need someone to develop behind Gawn, because I know it doesn't seem like it, but he will eventually stop and retire. I mean, he's just such a gun, Big Maxi. It feels like it'll never happen, but it's going to happen. And who have they got? They've got Tom Campbell, who they brought across from St Kilda 12 months ago now, I think. And yeah, he's a fine cover if Gawn gets injured sort of thing, but I can't see the two of them playing together. The other guy they got in this off-season was Max Heath from St Kilda. And I like this move from Melbourne because Heath is 23 and he played 4 games last year. I had a bit of a look at it. Obviously, well behind Marshall at St Kilda. And he's definitely behind Gawn, well, obviously. But, I mean, I really can see him playing a lot this year as a two-ruck setup with Gawn. And I don't think that means Gawn's scoring completely stops, but he has to drop back a touch. And they've really got to have a look at Heath and see if he's going to be the man to take over when Big Maxi moves on. Next, I've got Geelong. I mean, they're hard to sort of rank. I got them at 10th as likely to play the two. They're really hard because it's hard to know who their rucks will be. Reece Stanley's the man at the minute, and Blitzarves can do it as well. We've seen Sam de Koning as well play ruck at the start of last year, and I thought he looked pretty good, but I'm probably just looking through a fantasy lens and enjoyed those big scores he put up. And then, of course, you've got Toby Conway, who got a mention in my rankings earlier. And, I feel like when he's ready, it'll be him. But in the meantime, Stanley plays, Blitzarves plays with him, Sam de Koning plays in the back line. So I don't think they necessarily play a two-ruck setup per se, but they've just got so many guys that can play the role that, until we see Conway in action, it's really hard to get a read. Number 11 is GWS with Kieran Briggs, the main man at the moment. Jake Riccardi's pretty much been the backup guy in recent times. And Nick Madden, I spoke about earlier, I'm really excited to see maybe he gets a gig this year alongside Briggs in the two-ruck setup. And yeah, I think I would be surprised if we saw that this year. It's just, does Madden overtake Briggs? I mean, he will eventually, but I think Briggs needs to have a few more years at it before that happens. But who knows? Essendon are at 12th. I've got Nick Bryan as their man, and he's obviously going to miss the start of the season. And there's talk Peter Wright might even just ruck for the meantime. They've got Vigo Vicentini as well, who he got a look last year and looked okay, I think. And then they've got a young guy, Kyle Gareen, who's he's a fair way away from being ready. So the way I see it is Brian rucking with Wright as his backup, and yeah, it's probably a bit similar to the West Coast one. Is Wright going to just be a forward who chops out, or is he going to be an actual, high split ruck with Brian until Brian's ready to go it alone and has that confidence in his body back? But maybe they play Vicentini as well with Brian and leave Wright forward. Not too sure. Over to Sydney at number 13. Brodie Grundy had a incredible renaissance season last year. It was great to see. He actually wasn't that shabby in his first year at the Swans in 2024, but last year he reminded us why he was given the pig status back in those 2018, 2019 years at Collingwood. So he's going to be the man again. I just think Peter Laddams is a guy that we haven't heard the last of. He's getting older. I think he's about 28 now, and it feels like his chance to really shine at AFL level is probably gone, but he's still there. He's still on the list, and I think he offers a fair bit when he's playing consistent footy. And yeah, I could see him sharing with Grundy a bit this year if he gets into the side. And then he can obviously play forward as well, Laddams. And Grundy can play forward too, although, that year he spent at Melbourne with Max Gawn would probably suggest otherwise. For their backups, you got Hayden McLean who plays forward, but, he spends a bit of time chopping out for Grundy. And they've got Will Green, who's a future prospect, who I like what I've heard about him, but yeah, he's far too green at the minute. Will Green is far too green. I didn't even mean that. I'm going to take it though. We'll go on to number 14, Richmond, where Nank the Tank is just the man. And it's somewhat troubling, I'd say, if you're a Richmond supporter, because Nank Irvis has been brilliant, and he's not done yet. He's still got a few years to go, I'm sure. But I think of all these sides, all the sides in the AFL, I look at Richmond and say there's their number one, and then the next guy is just so far off it. I've landed on Samson Ryan, who I haven't minded. I remember he played a game against Adelaide 3-4 years ago probably, and Tigers won in Adelaide, I think. I just remember that was a big game from him. He kicked some important goals, and I thought, here we go. But yeah, he hasn't done a lot since, and I'm not even convinced he could be a number one ruck. But he's the only guy I can sort of see this year helping out with Nank, and it would be playing predominantly forward anyway. In their reserves, they've got some young guys. They've got Ollie Hayes-Brown and Tom Sims, who we did see a bit of last year. I think he's more of a key defender, but I guess they could look to maybe develop him into the ruck line. I'm not too sure, but yeah, I just know that if Nank Irvis wasn't there, or he finished up in 12 months' time, which he may do, I'm not sure what the Richmond ruck stocks are going to be for the next few years. Last few now, number 15, I've got North Melbourne. Tristan Sherry's the man. Taylor Goad's the backup, and he's a really good prospect, and I think he's going to be a good player in the future. I've heard good things about him this pre-season, and I think he'd have to be pretty close to a debut. I mean, he is only 20, so maybe not, but I don't think it's a bad idea for North to have a look at him and see how he can go in a two-ruck setup with the big X-Man, but it's pretty unlikely for me. I think Cherry will be solo for most of the year. And they've got ex-Tiger Callum Coleman-Jones still on the list, he's an interesting guy who hasn't really reached any heights yet, but is young enough, and I think we'll hopefully get another look at him. And, he could be someone that chops out in the ruck and helps Cherry as well. At 16, I've got Adelaide and Riley O'Brien, the big Rob Dog. He is the man, has been for some time now. And I really don't see the Crows playing a two-ruck setup. I think if they bring Lachlan McAndrew in for a debut, which I expect to see him at some point, look, they might play him together once, but I don't think it would be something that they stick with. I think if McAndrew comes in, it'll be to replace O'Brien. And, that's because I don't really see a spot on the field where O'Brien could play if he's not ruck. And then the other bit is, Riley Thilthorpe, who, emerged as one of the super forwards of the comp. And I think there's an argument to say you don't want to see him chopping out in the ruck because he's just so valuable. But I've also seen him in the ruck and he impacts, and the Crows look pretty dynamic. So I think they'll continue with the one ruck and Thilthorpe helping out. And they also got the big moose Finbar Maley over from North Melbourne. And he's going to have to fight hard to get a spot in the side. But if he does, he's another guy that can chop out in the ruck if needed. Number 17, I've got the Bulldogs. They've got Tim English, who's an absolute superstar and one of the rucks that could, at the moment, we feel could benefit from the rule changes. It feels like these changes are going to benefit those more agile, aerobic type rucks who get around the ground, almost play like an extra midfielder instead of a big lumbering brute. And, English has never been one whose score build depends on 40, 50 hit-outs. He does it in other ways. So I actually think he's going to be the number one ruck for scoring for 2026 in the league. And looking at the reserves for them, the Bulldogs don't really have. They've got Sam Darcy, who plays the same role as Thilthorpe. He's a elite young talent who's breaking out in the forward line, but also chops out in the ruck to help out. And then Rory Lobb's another guy that has attended a fair share of ruck contests in the last few years, but he's a key defender. So I think the Bulldogs just run with one ruck, English, and Darcy is the chop out guy. And that brings me to the last side, 18th, and that's Collingwood with Darcy Cameron, the main man. And the reason I've got them there is I couldn't even find a name to suggest that could maybe play as a second ruck with him. Dan McStay is sort of the backup guy, but obviously he's a forward, he's not a ruck. And then Mason Cox, as we know, is moved on to more purple pastures at Fremantle. So for Collingwood, it's just Darcy Cameron. So if you're a Darcy Cameron owner, he's another guy like English I think will benefit, that could benefit from the ruck rule changes. But he's also another guy I just don't see a world where he shares with anyone, which is good news for the DC owners. And that's my dive into the ruck setups of all 18 teams and who I think are the most likely to run with a two-ruck setup in 2026. How'd I go? Miss anything obvious there, or was I just about bang on? Let me know your thoughts on X on the Finders Keepers page at FindKeepAFL. Let me know your thoughts and give the page a like while you're at it. So we've arrived at the end of this week's episode and look, hopefully I've been able to give you some good ideas on who to target in the ruck line and a bit of an idea of how things will pan out this season in what's going to be an interesting season for the rucks with all these rule changes. Who knows, we might look back and nothing really changed and we got a little bit excited for nothing. But yeah, I think it's going to be different this year and yeah, looking forward to navigating our way through it. If you've enjoyed the episode, please leave a 5-star rating to help the podcast continue to grow, reach more listeners. And make sure you've liked and subscribed wherever you are listening. Next week on Finders Keepers is the last rankings episode as I tackle the forward line, which is probably my favourite fantasy position just due to the struggles that every year brings in trying to find the best. It's my favourite position to sort of analyse and try and find the diamonds in the rough, as they say. Now, I didn't have any listener questions on the ruckman this week, which was probably my fault anyway. I just needed to put the tweet out earlier in the week. So feel free to start sending your forward line questions in now for next week's episode, and that's on X at FineKeepAFL. As I said, next week is all about the forward line, so don't miss that. And good luck for anyone starting their Keeper League redrafts this week. I've got one next weekend that I'm looking forward to. Thanks for listening, and in the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers, and until next time, keep on keeping on.